On the morning of June 7, 1099, as the first Crusader knights crested the hills northwest of Jerusalem and gazed down at the Holy City, they believed their journey was essentially over. After 3 years of unimaginable hardship, after crossing thousands of kilometers, after victories at Nicaea, Dorylaeum, and Antioch, the walls of Jerusalem stood before them like a divine gift waiting to be unwrapped. The city had been recaptured by the Fatimid Caliphate from the Seljuks only the year before. Surely, the Crusaders thought, a garrison that had barely settled in, commanded by administrators rather than warriors, would crumble within days. Some knights openly wagered they'd be praying at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre within a week. They were catastrophically wrong. What followed was not a swift triumph, but a grinding, desperate siege that pushed the Crusader army to the absolute edge of collapse. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, commanding a garrison estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 4,500 men, would hold Jerusalem for 5 full weeks against a Crusader force more than 3 times his size. The defenders inflicted thousands of casualties, repelled multiple major assaults, and came within a hair's breadth of forcing the Crusaders to abandon the siege entirely. By mid-July, the Crusader army was dying of thirst, hemorrhaging men to disease and arrow fire, and on the verge of disintegration. The first assault on June 13th was a bloody disaster. The siege equipment burned, the water ran out, and the Fatimid relief army was marching north from Egypt. This is the story of how a significantly outnumbered garrison, fighting from behind walls in the scorching Palestinian summer, nearly destroyed the First Crusade in its final hour. This is the story of the philosophy that almost won: preparation, denial, and the weaponization of the desert itself. When Iftikhar ad-Dawla received intelligence that the Crusader army was marching south through the Levant in late May 1099, he had perhaps 2 weeks to prepare Jerusalem for siege. He was the Fatimid governor of Palestine, an administrator with military experience, but not a legendary warrior. He commanded a mixed garrison of Arab infantry, Sudanese troops, and 400 elite Egyptian cavalrymen. The total defensive force numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 4,500 men. He was facing an army of 12,000 to 13,000 Crusaders, including 1,200 to 1,300 mounted knights, the most devastating shock cavalry in the world at that time. The mathematics were brutal. Iftikhar could not win a pitched battle. He could not sally out and break the siege through offensive action. His only chance was to make Jerusalem so difficult to take, so costly to assault, that the Crusaders would either bleed out attempting it or be forced to retreat when the Fatimid relief army arrived from Egypt. This meant Iftikhar had to turn Jerusalem into a death trap. The first principle of his defensive philosophy was denial. If the Crusaders couldn't drink, they couldn't fight. If they couldn't build siege equipment, they couldn't breach the walls. Iftikhar systematically poisoned every well within a 6-mile radius of Jerusalem. His men cut down every tree, every grove, every source of timber in the surrounding countryside. The Judean hills, already sparse in vegetation, were stripped bare. The Crusaders would arrive to find a moonscape, a desert with a fortress in the center, and nothing else. The second principle was exclusion. Iftikhar expelled every Christian inhabitant from Jerusalem. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was cold, strategic calculation. At Antioch, an Armenian Christian named Firuz had opened the gates and allowed the Crusaders to pour into the city, turning a grinding siege into an instant Crusader victory. Iftikhar was not going to allow a repeat. Every potential collaborator, every potential spy, every Christian who might feel kinship with the Crusaders was forced out. This also reduced the number of mouths to feed. Iftikhar filled every cistern in the city to capacity. He stockpiled food and ammunition. He prepared for a siege that could last months. The third principle was the weaponization of Jerusalem's geography. The city's walls stretched 4 kilometers in length, 15 meters high, 3 meters thick. They were ancient, but they were maintained. There were 5 major gates, each guarded by a pair of towers. The eastern and southern sides of the city were protected by steep ravines, the Kidron Valley and the Valley of Hinnom. These sides were nearly impossible to assault. An army trying to approach from the east or south would have to descend into a ravine, cross it under fire, and then assault uphill against a 15-meter wall. It was suicide. That left two viable approaches: the southwestern corner near the Jaffa Gate and Tower of David, and the northern wall. Both were heavily fortified. The northern wall, in particular, had been reinforced with a secondary outer wall and dry moats. At the northwestern corner stood the quadrangular tower, a massive stronghold that could serve as a fortress within a fortress. Midway along the western wall stood the Tower of David itself, constructed of solid stones sealed with molten lead. According to contemporary accounts, 15 men inside the Tower of David could hold it indefinitely. It was an architectural nightmare for attackers. Iftikhar positioned his forces strategically. The majority of his garrison, including 9 of his 14 catapults, were concentrated on the southern and western walls, where Raymond of Toulouse's Provençal forces would eventually position themselves. The northern wall, while heavily fortified, had fewer men initially, because Iftikhar assumed the Crusaders would focus on the more accessible southwestern approach. This assumption would later prove partially incorrect, but it didn't matter. Iftikhar's preparations were so thorough that even the weaker northern defenses were formidable. When the Crusaders arrived on June 7th and began setting up their camps, they immediately encountered the consequences of Iftikhar's denial strategy. There was no water. The nearest safe springs were 6 miles away. Foraging parties that ventured out to find water were ambushed by the 400 elite Egyptian cavalrymen Iftikhar had assigned specifically to harassment operations. These light cavalry units were devastating. They knew the terrain, they struck fast, killed Crusader foragers, and vanished. The Crusaders began suffering casualties before they had even launched their first assault. The Crusaders divided their forces into 2 main camps. Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Flanders, and Tancred positioned themselves on the northern side, between the quadrangular tower and St. Stephen's Gate. Raymond of Toulouse and the southern French lords set up camp on the southwestern side, initially before the Tower of David, then relocating in front of the Zion Gate. This divided approach meant the Crusaders were not conducting a true encirclement. They lacked the manpower. Their forces, stretched out, covered maybe 1 kilometer of the 4-kilometer wall. The rest of Jerusalem was wide open. If Iftikhar had wanted to evacuate, he could have. But that wasn't the plan. The plan was to hold until the relief army arrived. The Crusader leadership quickly realized they were in trouble. They had no siege equipment. Iftikhar had cut down all the trees. There was one incident, almost absurd, where Tancred, suffering from dysentery, stumbled into a cave to relieve himself and discovered a small stack of hidden wood. This wood was used to construct a few scaling ladders. That was it, a handful of ladders against 4 kilometers of 15-meter walls. On June 13th, the Crusaders launched their first assault. It was a disaster. The attack focused on the northern wall, just east of the quadrangular tower. The Crusaders advanced with their scaling ladders, forming a testudo with interlocked shields to protect against arrow fire. The Fatimid defenders unleashed a barrage from the walls: arrows, stones, boiling liquids. The Crusaders managed to cross the ditch and storm the outer wall, the lower secondary fortification. Some sources claim they even got ladders up against the inner wall. But they couldn't climb it. The defenders on the battlements used 2-handed swords to literally hack the Crusaders off the ladders. Limbs were severed. Bodies tumbled down. After hours of brutal fighting, the Crusaders retreated. Both sides sustained heavy casualties, but the Crusaders gained nothing. This failure forced a strategic shift. On June 15th, the Crusader leadership held a council of war. They agreed to halt all further assaults until proper siege equipment could be constructed, but they had no wood, they had no engineers, and they were dying of thirst. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Men were forced to sew up the skins of dead oxen and buffaloes to use as water containers, carrying stagnant, foul-smelling water from springs 6 miles away. The water was so contaminated that some men accidentally swallowed leeches, which caused agonizing internal injuries and death. The heat was merciless. This was early June in Palestine, and the Crusaders, most of whom were from northern France and Normandy, were wearing padded armor and mail in temperatures that routinely exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat stroke and dehydration killed more men than Fatimid arrows in the first week. At night, the Crusaders banged stones together to keep venomous snakes away. The local wildlife was more dangerous than the garrison. The psychological toll was immense. These were men who had marched thousands of kilometers, who had survived the People's Crusade disaster, the grueling crossing of Anatolia, the sieges of Nicaea and Antioch, the cannibalism at Ma'arat. They were standing at the gates of the holiest city in Christendom, the culmination of their 3-year ordeal, and they couldn't get in. Morale began to crack. Then, on June 17th, a messenger arrived with news that changed everything. 6 ships, most of them Genoese, with some English vessels, had docked at the port of Jaffa, 35 miles northwest of Jerusalem. The port had been abandoned by the Fatimids, left undefended. The ships carried food, water, and critically siege materials, ropes, nails, tools, and skilled engineers and carpenters. This was the lifeline the Crusaders desperately needed. But retrieving those supplies was not simple. The Crusader leadership dispatched 3 squadrons to Jaffa. The first group, 20 knights and 50 infantry under Gildemar Carpinel, was ambushed en route by a 600-strong Fatimid detachment. The Crusaders were on the verge of being overwhelmed when the second group, 50 knights under Raymond Pilet, arrived and drove the Fatimids back. The battered Crusaders reached Jaffa and met with the sailors, who welcomed them with bread, wine, and fish. The Crusaders celebrated through the night. No sentries were posted. This was a catastrophic mistake. The Crusaders woke up on the morning of June 18th to discover that a large Fatimid fleet had surrounded the 6 European ships and was preparing to capture them. The Fatimids overran the port. The sailors and Crusaders barely escaped, but not before they offloaded as much cargo as possible and then set their own ships ablaze to prevent them from falling into Fatimid hands. The Crusaders, hauling supplies on foot and on camels, fought their way back to Jerusalem. They suffered casualties, but they brought back the materials needed to construct siege engines. This supply run demonstrated something critical about Iftikhar's strategy. He wasn't just sitting behind walls waiting to be attacked. His forces were active, aggressive, constantly harassing the Crusaders, interdicting their supply lines, forcing them to fight for every scrap of wood and every drop of water. The 400 elite cavalrymen were a persistent thorn, ambushing foraging parties, cutting down stragglers, making it dangerous for the Crusaders to venture far from their camps. This wasn't passive defense. This was an active, intelligent campaign to bleed the Crusaders dry. With the materials from Jaffa, the Crusaders began constructing siege equipment in earnest, but even this process led to conflict. One of the key engineers, a skilled craftsman, defected from Raymond of Toulouse's Provençal camp to Godfrey of Bouillon's northern camp. This defection was a significant blow to Raymond's prestige. Morale in the Provençal camp plummeted. Raymond was forced to pay his own men extra wages just to keep them from deserting. The northern camp, under Godfrey, Robert of Flanders and Tancred, was now the dominant faction. Robert of Normandy, seeing which way the wind was blowing, switched sides and took his men north. Even some of Raymond's own Provençal bannermen abandoned him. The Crusader leadership was fracturing at the worst possible time. There were bitter arguments about who would rule Jerusalem after it was captured. Some knights wanted to crown a king. The clergy argued that it would be sinful to crown a king in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns. They suggested that Jerusalem should be governed by the church and protected by a holy military order. These debates were fierce. One chronicler, Raymond of Aguilera, described the situation as a general quarrel among the leaders. The siege wasn't just a military operation, it was a political knife fight. While the Crusaders bickered, Iftikhar prepared for the next phase. His scouts observed the construction of the siege towers and reported their positions. Iftikhar redeployed his catapults and reinforced the sections of wall he believed the Crusaders would target. He stockpiled ammunition, piled stones and incendiary materials near the threatened sections, and prepared his men for the inevitable assault. The Fatimids also engaged in psychological warfare. They fixed wooden crosses to the battlements and spat on them, urinated on them, in full view of the Crusader camps. Rumors spread that the Muslims were desecrating the Holy Sepulchre itself. This wasn't just mockery, It was a calculated provocation designed to enrage the Crusaders, to make them reckless, to bait them into premature assaults. By early July, the Crusaders had constructed 2 massive siege towers, each 3 stories tall, mounted on wheeled platforms. These were engineering marvels for the 11th century. Godfrey's tower was particularly sophisticated. It was designed to be disassembled into sections and moved to different parts of the wall if needed. The towers were covered with interwoven branches and animal hides to protect against fire and projectiles. The Crusaders also built a huge battering ram with an ironclad head, several catapults, numerous scaling ladders, and portable wattle screens to shield men advancing on the walls. Raymond of Toulouse's men spent 3 days and nights filling the moat in front of the Zion Gate with rocks, creating a causeway for their siege tower to approach the wall. This was back-breaking labor under constant arrow fire. The Fatimids bombarded the Crusaders with their catapults, slowing progress, inflicting casualties. To intimidate the defenders, the Crusaders beheaded a captured Muslim nobleman in full view of the Tower of David. They also captured a spy who had been relaying messages between the garrison and the outside world. After interrogation, the spy was catapulted over the walls, his body smashing onto the rocks the Crusaders had piled in the moat. The psychological warfare was mutual and brutal. In the first week of July, one of the Crusader clergymen reported a vision. He claimed that the deceased Bishop Adhemar had appeared to him and instructed the Crusaders to conduct a barefoot religious procession around the walls of Jerusalem, blowing trumpets, just as Joshua had done at Jericho in the Bible. On July 8th, the entire Crusader army participated in this procession. Thousands of men, barefoot, walked around the perimeter of the city walls, chanting, blowing trumpets, carrying religious banners. The Fatimid garrison watched from the walls and bombarded them. Arrows rained down. Many priests and soldiers were killed. The procession turned into a bloodbath, but it continued. The Crusaders were desperate for divine intervention, for any sign that God had not abandoned them. This religious fervor, as irrational as it might seem, had a unifying effect. The quarreling princes temporarily set aside their disputes. The procession culminated on the Mount of Olives, where the clergy delivered a series of sermons. The message was clear: Jerusalem must fall, or they would all die trying. There was no retreat. The Fatimid relief army was marching north from Egypt. If the Crusaders didn't take the city soon, they would be trapped between the garrison and the relief force and annihilated. The final assault was scheduled for July 14th. But Godfrey of Bouillon had one more trick. For the past 3 weeks, his men had been constructing the northern siege tower in full view of the Fatimid garrison, positioned directly opposite the quadrangular tower. Iftikhar had concentrated his defenses there, reinforcing that section of wall, positioning catapults, stockpiling ammunition. On the night of July 13th, Godfrey ordered his siege tower disassembled, transported, and reassembled at a different location, approximately 150 meters east, near St. Stephen's Gate. This was an extraordinary feat of engineering and logistics. Moving a 3-story wheeled siege tower in the dark, silently, and reassembling it in a new position before dawn was one of the greatest tactical achievements of the entire First Crusade. When the sun rose on July 14th, the Fatimid garrison was stunned. The siege tower they had been preparing to defend against was gone. In its place, at a section of wall they had neglected, stood Godfrey's tower, ready to attack. Iftikhar frantically redeployed his men, but it was too late. The Crusaders had gained the initiative. The assault began at dawn. On the northern front, Godfrey's men pushed the massive battering ram toward the outer wall. The ram was a huge wooden construction with an ironclad head designed to smash through stone. As it advanced, the Fatimid defenders poured fire on it, attempting to burn it. They hurled projectiles kindled with sulfur, pitch, and wax. The ram caught fire. The Crusaders threw their remaining water supplies on it, trying to extinguish the flames, but it was no use. The ram burned. But then, in a bizarre reversal, the Crusaders deliberately kept the fire going, letting the ram burn completely so that it would clear the path for the siege tower. The Fatimids, realizing what was happening, began throwing water on the ram, trying to preserve it as an obstacle. This almost comical exchange demonstrates the desperation on both sides. Once the ram was reduced to ashes, the breach in the outer wall was clear. The Crusaders hauled the siege tower forward. This was the critical moment. The tower had to cross the ditch, navigate the rubble, and reach the inner wall without collapsing or catching fire. The Fatimids unleashed everything they had. 9 catapults on the southern wall were repositioned to fire on Godfrey's tower. Arrows, stones, flaming projectiles dipped in oil, and grease rained down. Some of the projectiles had nails embedded in them so they would stick into whatever they struck. The siege tower was hit repeatedly. Men inside caught fire. The structure itself began to smolder. At one point, a stone from a Fatimid catapult killed the man standing directly next to Godfrey of Bouillon. The stone missed Godfrey by inches. If it had struck him, the entire northern assault would have collapsed. But Godfrey's tower held. The construction was masterful. The interwoven branches and animal hides absorbed or deflected most of the incendiary projectiles. The tower inched forward, meter by meter, pushed and hauled by hundreds of men. The Crusaders on the upper levels of the tower fired crossbows and arrows at the Fatimid defenders on the walls, trying to suppress their fire. As the tower drew closer, the Crusaders gained the height advantage. They began clearing the walls of enemy archers. The gap between the tower and the wall narrowed to less than a meter. Then the Fatimids deployed their secret weapon, Greek fire. This was an incendiary substance, a mixture of naphtha, sulfur, and other chemicals that ignited on contact and could not be extinguished with water. It was one of the most feared weapons in medieval warfare. Several containers of Greek fire were hurled at Godfrey's tower. Flames erupted. The tower was engulfed. This should have been the end. Greek fire was supposed to be unstoppable, but the Crusaders had been given critical intelligence by the Christian inhabitants who had been expelled from Jerusalem before the siege. These expelled Christians, seeking revenge or hoping to curry favor, had told the Crusader leadership that Greek fire could be neutralized with vinegar. The Crusaders had filled wineskins with vinegar and stationed them throughout the siege tower. When the Greek fire hit, the Crusaders poured vinegar on it. The flames sputtered and died. The secret weapon had been countered. At the same time, whether due to Crusader fire or mishandled incendiaries, a nearby guard tower on the wall caught fire. Smoke poured from it, thick and choking. The Fatimid defenders couldn't stand near it. This created a gap in the defenses, a momentary blind spot. Godfrey seized the opportunity. He ordered his men to cut loose one of the animal hides that formed the outer skin of the siege tower, creating a makeshift bridge. The hide dropped onto the wall. Ludolf of Tournai and his brother Engelbert were the first Crusaders to cross. They rushed onto the wall, shields raised, and fought to establish a foothold. Behind them, more Crusaders poured across. Below, other Crusaders brought a scaling ladder and attached it to the same section of wall. Now, the Crusaders were flooding onto the walls from 2 points. The Fatimid garrison, concentrated on the southern and western walls, was caught off guard. Panic spread. The sight of Crusaders on the walls was devastating. The Fatimid defenders had held for 5 weeks. They had repelled multiple assaults, inflicted thousands of casualties, brought the Crusaders to the brink of collapse. But now the walls were breached. The psychological shock was immense. Cohesion disintegrated. Men began fleeing their posts. Some defenders jumped from the walls to their deaths rather than face the Crusaders. The northern front collapsed within hours. News of the breach spread to the southern front, where Raymond of Toulouse's forces were still struggling against the heavily defended Zion Gate. Raymond's siege tower had approached the wall multiple times on July 14th and 15th, and each time it had been repelled by the concentrated fire of 9 Fatimid catapults. The tower was hit so many times that it eventually caught fire and collapsed. Raymond's assault was failing, but when word arrived that Godfrey's forces had breached the northern wall and were inside the city, the Fatimid defenders on the southern wall abandoned their posts. They fled toward the Tower of David or the Temple Mount, seeking refuge. Raymond's men surged forward and entered the city through the southwestern gates. By midday on July 15th, the Crusaders controlled Jerusalem. The siege was over. The Fatimid garrison had been defeated, but Iftikhar ad-Dawla, the governor, was still alive. He and his elite cavalry, approximately 400 men, had retreated to the Tower of David, the most fortified position in the city. They locked themselves inside and prepared for a last stand. Raymond of Toulouse, recognizing that the Tower of David could hold out for weeks or even months, offered terms. In exchange for the tower and its treasures, Iftikhar and his men would be given safe passage to Ascalon, the nearest Fatimid stronghold on the coast. Iftikhar accepted. He surrendered the Tower of David. Raymond provided an armed escort, and Iftikhar and his surviving men left Jerusalem. They were the only significant group of Muslims to survive the fall of the city. Everyone else was slaughtered. What followed was one of the most notorious massacres in medieval history. The Crusaders went through Jerusalem systematically, house by house, killing every Muslim and Jew they found. Eyewitness accounts describe indiscriminate butchery. Women were stabbed in palaces and dwellings. Infants were seized by their feet and dashed against walls. Men were beheaded, shot with arrows, burned alive, or tortured before being killed. The streets ran with blood. Contemporary chroniclers, even those sympathetic to the Crusaders, described the carnage in apocalyptic terms. Raymond of Aguilers, an eyewitness and participant, wrote that in the Temple Mount area, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. The Gesta Francorum, another eyewitness account, stated that the slaughter was so great that Crusaders waded in blood up to their ankles. Fulcher of Chartres, who was not present but interviewed survivors, claimed that 10,000 people were killed in the Temple of Solomon alone, and that none were spared, neither women nor children. These numbers are likely exaggerated. Medieval chroniclers routinely inflated casualty figures, but even accounting for exaggeration, the scale of the massacre was immense. Modern historians estimate that between 3,000 and 40,000 Muslims and Jews were killed in the aftermath of the siege. Many Muslims fled to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount, hoping the sanctity of the site would protect them. Tancred and Gaston of Béarn gave some of them their banners, a medieval symbol of protection, promising they would be spared. But other crusaders ignored these promises and killed everyone. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilers described the scene: piles of heads, hands, and feet in the houses and streets, men and knights running over corpses. Some Muslims were mercifully beheaded, others were shot with arrows from the towers, others were tortured for a long time and burned to death in searing flames. The Jewish community of Jerusalem, which had fought alongside the Muslim garrison to defend the city, retreated to their synagogue as the walls were breached. The Crusaders burned the synagogue with the Jews inside. The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Qalanisi wrote that the Jews assembled in their synagogue and the Franks burned it over their heads. A contemporary Jewish letter from the Cairo Geniza collection, discovered in 1975, confirms the destruction of the synagogue, though it does not specify whether Jews were inside when it burned. Some prominent Jews were held for ransom and later freed when the Karaite Jewish community in Ascalon paid the required sums. The massacre lasted through July 15th and into the next day. On July 16th, the Crusader leadership ordered the surviving Muslims to drag the dismembered corpses out of the city. The bodies were piled outside the walls and burned in massive pyres. The stench was overwhelming. The anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum wrote that funeral pyres were formed from bodies like pyramids, and no one knows their number except God alone. After the bodies were disposed of, the Crusaders entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, their hands covered in blood and gold, and gave thanks for their victory. They sang hymns and wept with joy. The emotional whiplash, the transition from genocidal violence to religious ecstasy, is one of the most disturbing aspects of the First Crusade's conclusion. On July 17th, a council was held to decide who would rule Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon, who had led the successful assault on the northern wall, was the obvious choice. On July 22nd, he was named Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He refused the title of king, stating that he would not wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns. Raymond of Toulouse, having lost the political battle, refused any title and went on pilgrimage. In his absence, Arnulf of Schock was elected the first Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem on August 1st. On August 5th, After consulting the surviving inhabitants, Arnulf discovered the relic of the True Cross, which had been hidden during the siege. But the Crusaders' problems were not over. On August 12th, word arrived that the Fatimid relief army from Egypt had finally reached Ascalon, just 40 miles south of Jerusalem. This was the army that Iftikhar ad-Dawla had been waiting for. If it had arrived 2 weeks earlier, the siege would have failed. The Crusaders would have been trapped between the garrison and the relief force. But it was too late. Jerusalem had fallen. Godfrey of Bouillon led a Crusader army carrying the newly discovered True Cross south to confront the Fatimids at Ascalon. On August 12, 1099, the Crusaders won a decisive victory. The Fatimid army was routed. The threat was over. Following the Battle of Ascalon, the majority of the Crusaders considered their vows fulfilled. They had liberated Jerusalem. They had defeated the Fatimid counterattack. Thousands of knights and infantry returned home. Only a few hundred remained to garrison the new Kingdom of Jerusalem. But the victory was complete. The First Crusade, against all odds, had succeeded. But let's return to the siege itself, because the testimony of the defenders and the near success of Iftikhar's strategy reveals something critical. This was not a doomed garrison holding out for honor. This was a competent, well-prepared force that came extraordinarily close to winning. The Crusaders nearly collapsed multiple times. After the failed June 13th assault, morale was shattered. After the supplies from Jaffa were nearly lost, the Crusaders were on the verge of abandoning the siege. By mid-July, with the Fatimid relief army approaching, the Crusaders knew they had one chance, one final assault, and if it failed, they would have to retreat or be destroyed. The Fatimid defenders inflicted approximately 3,000 Crusader casualties during the siege. That's roughly 1/4 of the Crusader force. The Crusaders suffered from thirst, disease, heat stroke, arrow fire, and the psychological toll of being unable to breach walls they had expected to overcome in days. The Fatimid strategy of denial worked. The poisoned wells, the lack of wood, the constant harassment by light cavalry, the active defense, all of it pushed the Crusaders to the breaking point. And yet, the defenders lost. Why? Not because they were incompetent or cowardly. The Fatimid garrison fought with extraordinary determination and skill. They repelled the first assault entirely. They nearly destroyed Raymond's siege tower. They deployed Greek fire at the critical moment. They inflicted massive casualties and held for 5 weeks against overwhelming numbers. But they lost because of 3 factors: the Crusader supply run to Jaffa, Godfrey's tactical brilliance in moving the siege tower, and the intelligence about vinegar neutralizing Greek fire. Remove any one of those factors, and the siege fails. If the ships hadn't arrived at Jaffa, the Crusaders would have had no siege equipment. If Godfrey hadn't moved the tower, the Fatimids would have been prepared for the assault. If the Greek fire had worked, the tower would have burned, and the breach would never have occurred. Iftikhar ad-Dawla's strategy was sound. His execution was nearly flawless. He lost because of a logistical miracle, a brilliant tactical feint, and a piece of intelligence he couldn't have anticipated. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 was not a swift Crusader triumph. It was a desperate, grinding, near-run battle that the Crusaders almost lost. The Fatimid garrison, outnumbered 3-1, held for 5 weeks and inflicted devastating casualties. The defenders weaponized the desert, denied the Crusaders water and wood, and forced them into a race against time and a relief army. The Crusaders won by the narrowest of margins, and the cost was thousands of their own dead and one of the most infamous massacres in medieval history. The enemy's own testimony validates this. Iftikhar ad-Dawla, after surrendering the Tower of David and escaping to Ascalon, did not describe his defense as futile or doomed. He had held. He had inflicted massive casualties. He had nearly won. The relief army had been delayed. The Crusaders had gotten lucky. That was the difference. Not superior skill or divine favor, but luck. The Fatimids knew they had come within days of forcing the Crusaders to retreat. If the siege had lasted 1 more week, the relief army would have arrived, and the First Crusade would have ended in disaster. But let's examine the mechanics of the defense in greater detail, because this is where the true brilliance of Iftikhar's strategy becomes apparent. The poisoning of the wells wasn't a simple matter of dumping toxins into water sources. It required knowledge of hydrology, an understanding of which springs and wells the Crusaders would attempt to use, and the manpower to systematically contaminate them. Iftikhar's men didn't just poison the obvious wells near Jerusalem. They went out 6 miles in every direction, to every spring, every cistern, every water source, and rendered them unusable. This forced the Crusaders to travel enormous distances under the summer sun, carrying water in makeshift containers, and it made them vulnerable to ambush. The 400 elite Egyptian cavalrymen assigned to harassment operations were not a random force. They were light cavalry, fast and mobile, trained in hit-and-run tactics. They operated in small squads, striking at dawn or dusk when visibility was poor. They targeted Crusader foraging parties, water carriers, isolated groups. They didn't engage in pitched battles. They inflicted casualties and vanished. This is asymmetric warfare, and it was devastatingly effective. Over the course of 5 weeks, these 400 horsemen probably killed or wounded several hundred Crusaders, a casualty rate far exceeding what would normally be expected from such a small force. The cutting down of trees wasn't just about denying the Crusaders wood for siege, equipment. It was about denying them firewood, shelter, and construction materials for camps. The Crusaders had to sleep in the open or in improvised tents. They couldn't build proper fortifications for their camps. They were exposed to the elements and to potential sorties from the garrison. The lack of wood also meant the Crusaders couldn't build protective screens for their camps, making them vulnerable to arrow fire from the walls. Iftikhar's denial strategy was comprehensive. He stripped the landscape of everything useful and forced the Crusaders to suffer. The expulsion of Christians was a masterstroke. At Antioch, the Armenian Firuz had opened the gates because he felt sympathy for the Crusaders and resentment toward his Seljuk overlords. Iftikhar wasn't going to allow a repeat. By expelling every Christian, he eliminated the possibility of betrayal from within. But this decision also had a psychological impact on the Crusaders. When they arrived at Jerusalem, expecting to be welcomed by fellow Christians, they found a city emptied of friendly faces. The expelled Christians met the Crusaders outside the walls and told them about the defenses, about the poisoned wells, about the preparations. This intelligence was useful, but it also confirmed that the siege would be far harder than anticipated. The expelled Christians couldn't help from inside. They couldn't open gates or sabotage defenses. Iftikhar had turned Jerusalem into a purely military installation with no civilian vulnerabilities. The garrison's use of catapults demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of siege warfare. Iftikhar had 14 catapults, which doesn't sound like many, but their positioning and deployment were brilliant. 9 of the 14 were concentrated on the southern and western walls, where Raymond of Toulouse's forces were attacking. This concentration of firepower created an impenetrable zone. Every time Raymond's siege tower approached, it was bombarded by multiple catapults firing in coordinated volleys. The projectiles weren't just stones. The Fatimids used incendiary ammunition, bundles of wood wrapped in pitch, wax, and rags, set on fire and hurled at the tower. Some projectiles had nails embedded in them so they would stick into the wooden structure and continue burning. This wasn't random. This was calculated destruction. The remaining 5 catapults on the northern and eastern walls were used more sparingly, for harassment and suppression. They targeted Crusader camps, work crews building siege equipment, and any concentrations of troops. The Fatimids understood that catapults were most effective when concentrated, not dispersed. They didn't spread their artillery evenly along the walls. They massed it at the points of greatest danger and used it to devastating effect. The defenders' use of psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. Fixing crosses to the battlements and desecrating them wasn't just cruelty. It was a deliberate provocation designed to enrage the Crusaders and bait them into reckless assaults. The Fatimids understood that the Crusaders were motivated by religious fervor, and that this fervor could be weaponized against them. An enraged enemy makes mistakes. An enraged enemy abandons tactics and charges blindly. The Fatimids wanted the Crusaders to attack prematurely, before their siege equipment was ready, before they had solved the water problem. The June 13th assault, which failed catastrophically, may have been partially triggered by this psychological warfare. The rumor that the Muslims were desecrating the Holy Sepulchre was another form of psychological warfare. though it's unclear whether the Fatimids started this rumor or whether it emerged organically in the Crusader camp. Regardless, the effect was the same. It increased the Crusaders' desperation and their willingness to take enormous risks. The barefoot procession around the walls on July 8th, which resulted in many Crusader casualties from arrow fire, was a direct response to this psychological pressure. The Crusaders were so desperate for divine intervention that they were willing to march around the walls in full view of the defenders, making themselves easy targets because a clergyman had claimed Bishop Adhemar appeared to him in a vision. This is not rational military behavior, this is desperation, and the Fatimids exploited it. They bombarded the procession, killing priests and soldiers, turning a religious ceremony into a massacre. But they couldn't break Crusader morale entirely, because the Crusaders had nothing to fall back to. They had burned their bridges, literally and figuratively. There was no line of communication back to Antioch. There was no safe retreat. If they abandoned the siege, they would have to march back through hostile territory with a Fatimid army pursuing them. They would be cut to pieces. So the Crusaders had no choice but to continue, no matter how hopeless it seemed. This is the key to understanding why the siege lasted 5 weeks and why it was so close. Both sides were locked in a death struggle with no room for compromise. The Fatimids couldn't surrender because they knew what the Crusaders did to captured cities. The Crusaders couldn't retreat because they would be annihilated. The only possible outcomes were total Crusader victory or total Crusader collapse. There was no middle ground. Iftikhar's decision to position the majority of his forces on the southern and western walls was based on sound military logic. Those were the most accessible approaches. The northern wall, while less steep, was heavily fortified with the quadrangular tower and the secondary outer wall. Iftikhar assumed the Crusaders would focus on the southwestern approach, near the Jaffa Gate and Tower of David, because it was the shortest route from their camps to the interior of the city. He was partially correct. Raymond did attack there, but Iftikhar underestimated Godfrey of Bouillon's tactical flexibility. Godfrey's decision to build his siege tower opposite the quadrangular tower and then move it at night to a different location was a masterstroke of deception. The Fatimids spent 3 weeks preparing to defend against an assault on one section of wall, reinforcing it, positioning catapults, stockpiling ammunition. Then, in a single night, the threat vanished and reappeared elsewhere. The Fatimids didn't have time to redeploy, the catapults couldn't be moved quickly, the stockpiled ammunition was useless. The reinforced section of wall was no longer under attack. Godfrey had essentially reset the battlefield in his favor. But this maneuver was only possible because of the supplies from Jaffa. Without the skilled engineers and carpenters from the Genoese and English ships, Godfrey's tower couldn't have been designed to be disassembled and moved. It would have been a fixed structure, and the Fatimids would have been ready for it. The supply run to Jaffa, which nearly failed due to the Fatimid ambush and the naval blockade, was the turning point of the entire siege. If those ships hadn't arrived, if the supplies hadn't been retrieved, the Crusaders would have had no siege equipment, and the siege would have collapsed within days. And the Fatimids knew this. That's why they ambushed the Crusader squadrons en route to Jaffa. That's why they sent their fleet to blockade the port. They understood that denying the Crusaders, those supplies would win the siege. They came within a hair's breadth of success. The Crusader squadrons were nearly wiped out. The ships were nearly captured. But the sailors set the ships on fire, the Crusaders fought their way out, and the supplies made it back to Jerusalem. If the Fatimid ambush had been slightly larger, if the timing had been slightly different, the siege would have ended in Fatimid victory. The deployment of Greek fire on July 15th was the Fatimids' last desperate gamble. Greek fire was rare and expensive. It required specialized knowledge to manufacture and deploy. The Fatimids had been holding it in reserve, waiting for the critical moment. When Godfrey's siege tower reached the wall, and it looked like the Crusaders were about to breach the defenses, the Fatimids unleashed it. Multiple containers of Greek fire were hurled at the tower. Flames erupted. The tower should have burned. Greek fire was supposed to be unstoppable. But the intelligence about vinegar was the Fatimids' undoing. The expelled Christians who met with the Crusader leadership before the siege had told them about Greek fire and how to counter it. This intelligence was probably based on traditional knowledge, folklore, or perhaps even experience from previous sieges. Vinegar, being acidic, apparently had some effect on the incendiary mixture, either neutralizing it or slowing its burn. The Crusaders had prepared specifically for this weapon. When it was deployed, they were ready. The Greek fire was extinguished. The Fatimids' secret weapon had failed. This moment, more than any other, demonstrates how close the siege was. If the Crusaders hadn't known about the vinegar, the tower would have burned, the assault would have failed, and the Crusaders would have had to retreat. They didn't have the materials or time to build another tower. The Fatimid relief army was days away. The siege would have been over. But the vinegar worked, the tower survived, and the Crusaders got onto the walls. The panic that followed the breach is understandable. The Fatimid garrison had been under siege for 5 weeks, enduring constant bombardment, constant pressure, constant fear. They had held magnificently. They had inflicted enormous casualties. But when they saw Crusaders on the walls, when they saw the breach, something broke. The psychological shock of seeing the defenses penetrated after weeks of successful resistance was overwhelming. Men fled their posts. The southern wall, which had been holding against Raymond's assault, was suddenly abandoned. Defenders jumped from the walls rather than face the Crusaders in close combat. This wasn't cowardice. The Crusader reputation for savagery was well earned by this point in the campaign. At Antioch, the Crusaders had massacred the inhabitants. At Ma'arat, they had engaged in cannibalism, eating the bodies of slain Muslims. The Fatimid defenders knew what awaited them if they were captured. Death was certain, but the manner of death could be prolonged and agonizing. Jumping from the walls was a quicker end. Fleeing to the mosques or the Tower of David offered a slim hope of survival. The garrison's collapse wasn't a failure of courage, it was a rational response to an impossible situation. Iftikhar ad-Dawlah's retreat to the Tower of David with his elite cavalry was a final attempt to preserve some leverage. The Tower of David was the strongest fortification in Jerusalem. 15 men could hold it indefinitely. Iftikhar had 400. If he refused to surrender, the Crusaders would have to besiege the tower separately, and that could take weeks or months. The Crusaders didn't have that kind of time. The Fatimid relief army was approaching, so Raymond of Toulouse, pragmatic as always, offered terms. Iftikhar accepted. He surrendered the tower and its treasures in exchange for safe passage. Raymond honored the agreement and provided an armed escort. This was the only organized, negotiated surrender of the entire siege. Every other Muslim and Jew in Jerusalem was killed. Iftikhar and his 400 cavalrymen were the sole survivors. They marched to Ascalon under Crusader escort and lived. This detail is important because it shows that the massacre was not inevitable. Surrender terms were possible. The Crusaders were capable of honoring agreements, but those terms were only extended to the garrison commander and his elite troops, not to the civilian population or the ordinary soldiers. The massacre that followed was systematic and deliberate. The Crusaders went house by house, methodically killing everyone they found. The anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum describes the process. Whoever entered a house first claimed everything inside as their own, and no one else could interfere. This created a perverse incentive structure. Crusaders rushed through the city, claiming houses, seizing valuables, and killing the inhabitants. Many Muslims had swallowed gold coins to hide them. The Crusaders discovered this and began disemboweling corpses to retrieve the coins. This created a horrific stench that was described by multiple chroniclers. The scale of the killing is difficult to determine with precision. Medieval chroniclers routinely exaggerated numbers. Ibn al-Athir's figure of 70,000 casualties is almost certainly inflated. Jerusalem probably didn't have a population of 70,000 at the time. The city's population had been swollen by refugees fleeing the Crusader advance, but even accounting for that, 70,000 is implausible. The more conservative estimate of 3,000 to 40,000 is based on modern analysis of the city's likely population, the duration of the massacre, and comparisons with other medieval sieges. Fulcher of Chartres' claim that 10,000 were killed in the Temple of Solomon alone is also probably exaggerated, but it indicates that the Temple Mount area was the site of concentrated slaughter. Many Muslims fled there, hoping the sanctity of the site would protect them. It didn't. Tancred and Gaston of Béarn gave their banners to some Muslims as a guarantee of protection, But other Crusaders ignored these promises. The banners were meaningless. Everyone was killed. The burning of the synagogue with the Jewish community inside is corroborated by multiple sources, both Muslim and Jewish. The Cairo Janaza letter confirms that the synagogue was destroyed, though it doesn't explicitly state that Jews were inside when it burned. Ibn al-Qalanisi, writing within decades of the event, states clearly that the Jews were burned alive in their synagogue. The Jewish community of Jerusalem, which had fought alongside the Muslim garrison, was annihilated. The few Jews who survived were those who were captured and held for ransom, later freed when the Karaite community in Ascalon paid for their release. The speed of the massacre is noteworthy. The city fell at midday on July 15th. By the evening of July 16th, the killing was largely over, and the Crusaders were forcing surviving Muslims to drag the bodies out of the city. This means the massacre lasted approximately 30 hours. In that time, thousands of people were killed. The efficiency of the killing suggests it was organized, not spontaneous. The Crusader leadership may have explicitly ordered the massacre, or at least tacitly approved it, as a way of eliminating any potential resistance and as a form of religious cleansing. The emotional transition from massacre to religious celebration is one of the most disturbing aspects of the event. After spending hours killing men, women, and children, the Crusaders walked to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, still covered in blood, and wept with joy. They sang hymns, they prayed, they thanked God for their victory. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilers describes this scene without any sense of irony or contradiction. For the Crusaders, the massacre and the religious celebration were not in conflict. They were two parts of the same holy mission. The killing of Muslims and Jews was not a sin. It was a righteous act, a purification of the holy city, a fulfillment of God's will. This mindset is alien to modern sensibilities, but it was central to the Crusader worldview. The First Crusade was not just a military campaign. It was a holy war, a cosmic struggle between good and evil, between Christianity and Islam. The Crusaders believed they were God's instruments, that their actions were divinely sanctioned, that any atrocity committed in the service of the holy cause was justified. This belief system allowed them to commit acts of extraordinary violence without guilt or remorse. But let's return to the siege itself and examine why the Fatimid defense came so close to succeeding. The key factors were preparation, denial, and time. Iftikhar had 2 weeks to prepare Jerusalem for siege. He used that time brilliantly. He poisoned the wells, cut down the trees, expelled the Christians, filled the cisterns, stockpiled supplies, reinforced the walls, positioned his catapults, and deployed his cavalry for harassment operations. Every decision he made was designed to slow the Crusaders down, to force them into a war of attrition, to make them suffer. And it worked. The Crusaders suffered enormously. They were dying of thirst, disease, and heat stroke. They couldn't build siege equipment because there was no wood. They couldn't forage safely because of the cavalry ambushes. They couldn't advance because the walls were too strong and too well defended. Every day that passed weakened them further. Every day brought the Fatimid relief army closer. By mid-July, the Crusaders were on the brink of collapse. If the siege had lasted 1 more week, they would have been trapped between the garrison and the relief army, and they would have been annihilated. But 3 things saved the Crusaders. First, the supply run to Jaffa provided the materials and expertise needed to build siege equipment. Without those supplies, the Crusaders would have had nothing. Second, Godfrey's tactical brilliance in moving the siege tower created a vulnerability in the Fatimid defenses. Without that deception, the assault would have targeted a heavily reinforced section of wall and likely would have failed. Third, the intelligence about vinegar neutralizing Greek fire allowed the Crusaders to counter the Fatimids' secret weapon. Without that knowledge, the siege tower would have burned, and the assault would have failed. Remove any one of those 3 factors, and the Crusaders lose. That's how close it was. The Fatimid defense was not a doomed last stand. It was a sophisticated, well-executed strategy that nearly succeeded. Iftikhar ad-Dawla, with a garrison of 3,000 to 4,500 men, held Jerusalem for 5 weeks against 12,000 to 13,000 Crusaders, inflicted approximately 3,000 casualties, and came within days of forcing the Crusaders to retreat. That is an extraordinary military achievement. The Crusaders themselves acknowledge this. After the battle, there was no triumphalism about how easy the siege had been. The chroniclers describe it as a desperate struggle, a near-run thing, a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. Godfrey of Bouillon, when he was offered the crown of Jerusalem, refused it, saying he would not wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns. This wasn't just humility, it was an acknowledgement of how narrowly they had won, how much they had suffered, how many of their comrades had died. The Fatimid defenders left no written accounts of the siege. We have no testimonies from Iftikhar ad-Dawla or his officers describing their strategy or their perspective. But we can infer their thoughts from their actions. They fought with extraordinary determination. They used every resource available to them. They inflicted massive casualties. They held for 5 weeks against overwhelming odds. And when the walls were finally breached, many of them chose death over surrender because they knew what surrender meant. The later Muslim chroniclers, writing decades after the event, described the fall of Jerusalem as a catastrophe, a day of mourning, a wound that would never heal. Ibn al-Athir, writing around the year 1200, described the massacre in vivid detail and framed it as an atrocity that justified centuries of jihad against the Crusader states. The siege of Jerusalem became a rallying cry for Muslim resistance, a symbol of Crusader brutality, a memory that fueled the eventual reconquest of the city by Saladin in 1187. But the immediate Fatimid response was more pragmatic. Iftikhar ad-Dawla, after escaping to Ascalon, reported to the Fatimid authorities in Cairo. The relief army that had been marching north turned around and consolidated at Ascalon. The Fatimids prepared for a counterattack. On August 12th, less than a month after the fall of Jerusalem, the Fatimid army engaged the Crusaders at the Battle of Ascalon. The Fatimids were defeated. The counterattack failed. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was established and would endure for nearly 90 years. But the siege itself remains a testament to the effectiveness of defensive warfare when properly executed. Iftikhar ad-Dawla, with limited resources and limited time, created a defensive system that nearly destroyed the First Crusade. His strategy of denial, preparation, and active defense forced the Crusaders to the edge of collapse. He understood that he didn't need to win a battle. He just needed to survive long enough for the relief army to arrive. He almost succeeded. The Crusaders won because they got lucky. The ships arrived at Jaffa. Godfrey moved the tower. The vinegar worked. These were contingencies that Iftikhar couldn't control. He did everything right, and he still lost. That's the brutal reality of warfare. Sometimes the better strategy, the better preparation, the better execution still result in defeat because of factors beyond anyone's control. And the Crusaders knew it. In their private moments, in their letters and journals, they acknowledged how close they had come to disaster. They described the siege of Jerusalem not as a glorious triumph, but as a harrowing ordeal that they barely survived. They described the heat, the thirst, the disease, the constant bombardment, the fear that the relief army would arrive before they could breach the walls. They described the moment when Godfrey's tower reached the wall as a miracle, a divine intervention, because without it, they would have been lost. This is the final testimony, the most powerful proof of how close the siege was. The Crusaders themselves, in their own words, admitted that they were on the brink of defeat. They admitted that the Fatimid defense was far stronger than they had anticipated. They admitted that without luck, without the supplies from Jaffa, without Godfrey's brilliance, without the vinegar, they would have failed. The enemy didn't need to testify to the strength of the defense. The victors testified to it themselves. And that is the story of the siege of Jerusalem in 1099. Not a swift Crusader triumph, but a desperate, grinding, near disaster that the Crusaders won by the narrowest of margins against a Fatimid garrison that defended with extraordinary skill and determination. The siege was supposed to last days. It lasted 5 weeks. The Crusaders were supposed to be fighting administrators and clerks. They were fighting a competent, well-prepared military force. The siege was supposed to be the glorious culmination of the First Crusade. It was a bloodbath that nearly ended in Crusader annihilation. 300 to 4,500 Fatimid defenders held Jerusalem for 5 weeks and inflicted 3,000 casualties on a Crusader army more than 3 times their size. They weaponized the desert, denied the Crusaders water and wood, and forced them into a race against time. They deployed sophisticated defensive tactics, concentrated firepower, psychological warfare, and secret weapons. They came within days of forcing the Crusaders to retreat. They lost because of 3 contingencies they couldn't control: the supply run, the tactical deception, and the intelligence leak. That is how close it was. That is why the Crusaders were shocked. And that is why the siege of Jerusalem in 1099 remains one of the most remarkable defensive stands in medieval history. The Fatimids lost the battle, but they nearly won the war. And the Crusaders, for all their eventual triumph, never forgot how close they came to total defeat at the gates of the Holy City.